This pillbox here on the edge of the cliff will outlast the cliff probably. This will all erode away one day and it'll fall down into the sand and then go into the ocean. This is part of the fortification of Hobart that existed during the war, and it looks out of place because it is, because it belonged to a time when everything was different in the minds of the people that lived in Hobart. The shores of Hobart couldn't have been further away from the shores of Europe, but on the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Menzies announced the beginning of Australia's involvement in what became World War II. Australia was very much not ready for another war. The army only had around 3,000 soldiers. After voluntarily signing enlistment papers, men were assembled at barracks. Still without uniforms, they were paraded through the middle of town, carrying a banner declaring that they'd joined the Australian Imperial Force. So we're out here at Pontville. This is a whole bunch of kilometres away from the centre of Hobart. This used to all be fields, and these buildings here were the first buildings built out in what used to be farmland. And the buildings behind us here look like they should probably be condemned, knocked down to build more of the suburb that surrounds us. But they're still there, bloody dog, because they're part of the national heritage. It's a very important location connected to Australia's involvement in World War II. The enlisted were taken to the ill-prepared Brighton military camp in what's now called Pontville. The facility was a tent city for the first 6 months or so, until more substantial buildings could be erected. Recruits were fitted with uniforms and provided with basic gear before training began. Old artillery left over from the First World War, like the 18-pounder Mark I, were used for training, as newer guns were unavailable in Tasmania. Training occurred outside the Brighton camp too. Often men were sent to the bush without knowing their locations. Soldiers in full uniform and kit trained with a Vickers machine gun. The Tasmania Command Tactical Group, in convoy, had to practice changing tyres while bogged down. Urban warfare was simulated, like here on Hewen Road near Longley. As much training was done in secret as possible. In the back hills of Cambridge, there is an area that contains a dozen or so ruins camouflaged beneath the canopy. Unofficially, now known as Air Force Gully, a lack of written evidence seems to indicate the base was enveloped in secrecy for a reason. There's a whole bunch of these slabs out here in the bush. Most of them are pretty hard to spot, not just because they don't have bits of recent artwork put on them. They're generally covered up. This one has a different aspect, so it sort of sits up a bit more on the land. I don't know what was going on here. There was some sort of plumbing. You can see that the walls that used to sit on the top have been deliberately taken down at some point, and there's no remnants of them. What was going on here during the war, I do not know. We do not know. It is a genuine mystery. It was probably connected to the airfield, so it may have been a munitions storage facility, but we just don't know. It is one of those things that belongs in the past, and it sort of sits there as a mystery that you can visit and you can't quite get a grip of. Maybe somebody knows, maybe the Australian Defence Force, but members of the public are kept in the dark to this day. Tasmania had a fleet of 12 RAAF Tiger Moth airplanes that were based in Hobart. Out at Cambridge Airport, the man in charge can be seen surveying them after landing. Trainee pilots went through Air Force pre-selection before being shipped to the mainland for full training. The pilots in charge of this testing process were usually too old for combat duty. The Air Force used a fighter pilot training machine to simulate runs. But the Tiger Moths also did regular runs too. Here they are passing at low altitude over the CML building on the corner of Macquarie and Elizabeth. Rallies were often held, and this one was for the Royal Australian Navy, where the warship model made to create interest. Events like this were usually held on the corner of Macquarie and Elizabeth Streets, outside the town hall, right next to the city's primary enlistment booth. Once training was completed, there would be a march through the streets. The civilians would come out and cheer them, wishing them well. Women also enlisted, most commonly as nurses. Here they are coming up Liverpool Street. Those in dark uniforms belong to the Australian Armed Forces, and those in lighter colours are with the Red Cross. Departures occurred from the Hobart Central train station. At this point it would mostly be family and close friends waving them off. Troops, however, were mostly transported from Hobart to Sydney by passenger liners, used as troop carriers, sometimes mingling with ordinary passengers. All adults were required to carry identification cards with them at all times. It was one of many clerical imposts. Butter, tea, meat, tobacco and petrol were all rationed. At the service station, ration stamps had to be torn off in order to gain your allocation of fuel. With petrol being readily unavailable, locals began modifying their vehicles with coal burners. Coal was loaded into the top, a fire started beneath it, producing coal gas that powered the engine. In sudden need of ambulances on standby, the Defence Department had the power to commandeer any vehicle deemed suitable. Cadbury chocolate trucks were converted to carry injured. If you had a car that hadn't been taken away from you, you could only drive at night with blackout slits on the headlights. This vehicle was driving on an elevated timber roadway in Huonville, a reminder of how primitive things could still be outside the capital. The shortage of fuel and vehicles saw a resurgence of horsepower. Like stepping back in time, more and more horses were used to haul cartage around the city. In some way, almost everyone was involved in the effort. Men who were either too old or unfit for active service performed groups like the Volunteer Defence Corps and the Civil Defence League, and air raid wardens were appointed. The Defence Department would perform demonstrations on how to deal with ruptured gas lines. Women raised money through organisations like the Red Cross and Rotary, and they did, among other things, provide comfort food parcels for troops abroad. The Australian military captured a German sea mine and disarmed it and placed it on the grass for children to touch. A German fighter plane was paraded through the streets of Hobart and later set up in the City Hall for public inspection. Sitting in the cockpit is the Governor. Before the University of Tasmania's Sandy Bay campus was built, the site had long been a recreational rifle range. During the war, the Army put on an exhibition. They put them on regularly, with soldiers demonstrating the use here of an 18-pounder. Facing in the opposite direction, they showed off a 2-pounder anti-tank gun. Weapons were always fired, blanks were only ever used. We're down here on the windy, dirty banks of the River Derwent, and we're wondering, why would Hobart, a small provincial town, ever be considered a target during World War II? Well, the answer's over there on the other side of the water, and the answer is zinc. The Risdon Zinc Works was already fully operational. Its metallurgy only became more valuable once the nation went into war. The zinc refined there was used for a wide variety of military products. To protect the smelting facility, a number of searchlights were placed at the ready on each side of the Derwent, as well as a series of anti-aircraft artillery. Further up the river and slightly inland at Glenorchy, the munitions factory was built, erected on the site of the former Ascot racetrack. These 25-pounder projectiles were produced by a mainly female workforce. Women were hurried into the assembly lines, forced to learn highly skilled operations in short periods. Their efforts were materially important to the war effort. In the outer areas of Hobart, women formed what was officially called the Land Army. They tilled the land by hand and picked fruit, ploughed fields with tractors and milked cows. Their harvests fed the island. We're here on the domain, and the Hobart High School is back there, the old Hobart High School. During the war, the Brooker Highway wasn't there either. And a lot of these trees weren't here. And beneath us were a series of trenches that were made exclusively for children if the bombs were to start landing. Air raid shelters were built all across the capital, not just in schools. People built private ones in their backyards, and in Franklin Square, most of the available lawn area was converted. Emergency protection structures were placed in the middle of the roads, like here on Bathurst Street, or here on Campbell Street, next to the hospital. Inside the hospital, nurses were taught to put babies underneath the furniture. In the 1940s, buildings didn't have the same perceived heritage value as what they do today, so the power of religion was evoked instead. The Civil Defence Authority produced this mock photograph to show how St Mary's Cathedral could look if it was bombed. Although never bombed, Hobart did lose part of its architectural heritage to the war. Franklin Square did have an ornate wrought iron fence around its perimeter. It was a piece of high craftsmanship and a point of pride in the city, but it was also a raw material. Cut apart and melted down, it was sacrificed to England to be turned into nuts and bolts. There were plans to remake it after the war had ended, plans that never eventuated. Early in the war, German mines were allegedly found at the mouth of the Derwent. How they got there remains a mystery. The river had to be closed, though, until they could be destroyed. Towards the end of the war, the Nazi submarine U-862 performed a long mission from Jakarta to New Zealand and back, along the way sinking 2 ships and attacking others, including a thwarted encounter with a tanker southeast of Hobart in the Tasman Sea. Japanese invasion was considered a distinct possibility. It was something that brewed in the minds of the people living in Hobart during the war. Japan had convincingly won the Battle of Darwin, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had made a series of attacks on Newcastle and Sydney. Ace fighter pilot Nobuo Fujita had flown reconnaissance over Sydney and Melbourne and indeed Tasmania. It would have been too risky for the Japanese to enter Hobart via Storm Bay. They would more likely have come down the east coast before landing. One likely spot could have been the mouth of Prosser River at Orford. From there they could have travelled by road all the way to Hobart. With no bridges to demolish in order to stop their advance, they could have moved quickly. Had the Japanese made that assumption, they would have been wrong. Almost as soon as they began heading up the Tasman Highway from Orford, they would have been stopped. There would have been the detonation of blasting explosives along the face of the cliff, crashing thousands of tons of boulders and rock columns in their path. If the Japanese had been able to compromise the island's lines of communication, another measure had been taken. After the satisfactory completion of trials, it was decided to establish the Pigeon Service as part of the Australian Corps of Signals. Military fortification at places like Lauderdale prevented the enemy from ever entering Hobart directly. Pearson's Point Battery had a series of tunnels and housing for personnel, and it was the only facility to fire in anger, although not at the enemy. An American Liberty ship came up the Derwent without permission, so a single shot was sent across her bow as a warning. The most haunting ruins can be found at Point Direction. Down here at Fort's Erection, we're actually quite a long way outside of Hobart, but it's still sort of Hobart because this is where Hobart was protected from. Out there we've got the Pot Lighthouse that was used to protect ships that would come into shore. This was built during the war to defend Hobart from enemy ships that might be trying to come in. You feel quite isolated down here because it is isolated. Even now, to get access, you have to walk along several beaches. The only real sort of sound about are those seagulls down on the rocks. It must have been quite lonely, but then again, they're all in it together. So I guess there must have been quite a lot of comradeship, you know, carrying them throughout the war, which was indicative of everybody that went through the war. It's not so easy to imagine that 8 decades ago, a bunch of people, mostly men, all younger than me, were down here for days and weeks and months on end, not knowing how it was all going to work out. But thankfully know that nothing too bad happened to Hobart, and one of the reasons that nothing bad did happen here was because of this facility and the others that protected Hobart, and more importantly, all the people that put so much on the line because they were backed into a corner by circumstances of where and when they were born. So there's a seaplane up there, just flying past it to be on a scenic trip for tourists, but it gives you some sort of clue about how on edge you might have been when you were down here, on the lookout, scanning the horizon, wondering if that noise in the distance was something, or maybe just nothing. Walking through the doorway, there's not much here, but there is the reinforced concrete that protected the heavy artillery that was in place in the 1940s. This is where it all would have gone down. This is where the big guns pointed out to the edge, where the top of the ocean meets the bottom of the sky. Get him, dog. And not to be too dramatic or silly about things, but when something ends, it doesn't just go away.
The war ended in September 1945 and Australia had won. When the news arrived in Hobart, it was time for celebration. People embraced strangers like loved ones, tears of joy, ecstatic laughing, dancing in the street. The day after, the booth that was used to enlist new soldiers on the corner of Elizabeth and Macquarie outside Town Hall was demolished. The war was over, but it was also not over. The 2nd 40th Infantry Battalion was the only battalion in the AIF recruited almost entirely from Tasmania. Initially, training was done at the Brighton camp before continuing on to the mainland. In February 1942, they were sent to Timor to defend an airfield as part of Sparrow Force. Less than 1,000 diggers facing off against an invading Japanese army of a reported 23,000 men. After several days of intense fighting and small victories, they were forced to surrender. Becoming prisoners of war, they were enslaved by the Japanese in camps throughout Southeast Asia, including being put to work on the Thai-Burma Railway. Many men were slaved to death. The poetic injustice of it all. People whose ancestors were, in some cases, transported by the British Empire to the island of Van Diemen's Land found themselves a century later enlisted in the Imperial Army, only to be captured by the Japanese military and becoming themselves prisoners of war, again in a foreign faraway land, and again forced to work unjustly to the bone. 3 years later, following the formal surrender of Japan, the surviving men were liberated back to Tasmania. The Hobart of 1945 and the Hobart of today are like foreign countries to each other. Many of those people who defended the city during World War II might find the place today unrecognisable. Out of the horror and folly of every war comes perhaps the only lesson that grants solace. The lesson is about ordinary people and how they are not ordinary. The things that happened to them lived in them when they lived in the city again. And in that way, more than any other, World War II shaped Hobart.